The dog hit the door before it fully opened. 104 pounds of retired military Belgian Malinois, all muscle and scar tissue and unspent combat instinct, and he cleared the reception desk in a single lunge that sent a technician backward into a shelf of supplies. Syringes scattered. A tray of instruments hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Another staff member dropped flat and covered her head. The third, a young man who'd only started 3 weeks ago, pressed himself against the wall and didn't breathe. The veteran holding the leash was a big man. He'd handled war dogs in 3 combat theaters. He was pulling back with everything he had, and the dog wasn't stopping. Then a woman stepped forward from the back hallway. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for anything. She just walked into the middle of that chaos, coffee still in her hand, scrubs still wrinkled from a 12-hour shift, and she said one word. The dog stopped, not slowed, stopped. And every person in that room stared at the woman they'd been ignoring for 2 years. If you're watching this story unfold, stay with me until the very end. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment below with the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Cascade Valley Veterinary Clinic sat on the eastern edge of Dillon, Montana, a town that couldn't decide if it was still growing or slowly giving up. The clinic handled everything from livestock calls out on Route 9 to the occasional emergency that came in off the interstate. A dog hit by a car, a colt with a fractured leg, once a black bear someone had tried to keep as a pet. It wasn't glamorous work. The equipment was old. The staff was small. The pay was unremarkable. Natalie Cross had worked there for 22 months. She was 36 years old, medium height, with short brown hair she never bothered to style, and hands that moved with a precision that didn't match her job title. She was a veterinary nurse. Level 2 certification, no specialty credentials on the wall, nothing that set her apart on paper from any other technician at any other mid-sized clinic in rural Montana. She showed up early, cleaned instruments, assisted in surgeries, restocked supplies, and went home to her rented house on the edge of town where she cooked something simple and slept without talking to anyone. She wasn't unfriendly, she just didn't volunteer information about herself. And in a small clinic where the social currency was shared, history, who grew up here, who married who, whose family ran which ranch, that made her an outsider in a way that had calcified over time into assumption. The clinic's lead veterinarian, Dr. Ronald Prescott, had hired her because she'd tested well and her references were clean. He'd come to respect her work in a limited way, the way you respect a piece of equipment that functions reliably. He'd never asked her where she learned to do the things she could do. She hadn't offered to tell him. The rest of the staff had their own read on her. Maya, the senior technician, had decided within the first month that Natalie was either hiding something embarrassing or suffering from depression. Joel, the youngest technician, thought she was arrogant in a quiet way, like she knew more than the rest of them and was too polite to say it. The receptionist, Dana, had simply written her off as a closed book and stopped trying. None of them were entirely wrong. None of them were close to right. The morning that changed everything started the way most mornings did, with an intake log that was already backed up, a coffee machine that had been broken since Tuesday, and an argument in the back hallway about whose turn it was to handle the overnight kennels. Natalie was restocking the surgical tray when she heard the truck pull in. She didn't look up immediately. Trucks pulled in all morning, but she heard the engine idle longer than normal, and then she heard the specific quality of silence that follows it. Not the silence of someone gathering a pet carrier, but the silence of someone sitting behind the wheel doing something harder than parking. She looked out the window. A dark green pickup, newer model, Montana plates. A man sat behind the wheel with both hands on the steering wheel and his head slightly lowered. Broad through the shoulders, the way men get when they've carried weight professionally for a long time. She watched him for about 30 seconds. Then he opened the door. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a canvas jacket, but he moved the way military people move when they've been out long enough to stop trying to hide it. Deliberate, economical. The kind of movement that comes from years of operating in environments where being slow meant something specific. He went around to the rear of the truck, the back seat. He opened the door with one hand and kept the other steady on something inside. Natalie was already moving toward the front before she understood why. She was behind the reception desk when he came through the door with the dog. The Belgian Malinois hit the threshold and the world reorganized itself around his arrival. Joël, who had been filing intake forms at the desk, lurched backward and caught his chair on the way down. Dana screamed, a short, cut-off sound, and went sideways off her stool. A display rack of pet vitamins went with her. The dog's nails on the linoleum sounded like something mechanical, like gears catching, and the leash was a rigid bar of tension between the man's fist and the dog's collar, and neither end was winning. "Bravo!" The man's voice was low and controlled but cracked slightly on the second syllable. "Bravo, heel." The dog didn't heel. He was 104 pounds of Belgian Malinois with a scar running from his left ear to the base of his skull, and whatever was wrong with him, whatever pain or fear or confusion had fired behind those amber eyes, it was overriding everything his training had built into him. Maya, coming from the back hallway, stopped dead in the doorway and pressed herself flat against the frame. "Someone call animal control," she said, her voice completely even in the way that means the opposite. The man looked like he was about to say something that came from deep embarrassment and exhaustion and the specific grief of watching an animal you love become something dangerous. His jaw was set. His eyes were red-rimmed in a way that had nothing to do with the morning. Natalie walked forward. She heard Maya say her name behind her. She heard Donna somewhere on the floor say, "What is she doing?" She didn't stop. She moved at the pace you move when you don't want to communicate urgency to someone who's already scared. Steady, direct, without hesitation but without pressure. She stopped 4 feet from the dog. Bravo turned his attention to her. The hackles were still up. The amber eyes were scanning her with the trained assessment of an animal that had spent years learning how to classify threats. His weight was forward, which meant he wasn't done deciding. Natalie crouched down. Not all the way? Not submission, not confrontation. The neutral space in between. She let her hands hang loose in front of her, and she looked slightly to the left of the dog's face, not at his eyes. And she said quietly, in a register that carried no command and no pleading, "Bravo, Ruhi." The German word for calm. The dog's hackles dropped, not gradually, all at once. He stood there for 2 seconds with his head slightly tilted, as if recalibrating something. Then he stepped toward her. Not the lunge of before, but deliberate, and pushed his nose against her palm. The room was completely silent. Natalie ran her hand along the dog's jaw, up behind his ear, assessing while she seemed to just be calming. Her fingers pressed carefully along the base of his neck, his shoulder, tracing down his left flank. She felt him flinch, a small contraction of muscle, barely visible, when she reached his left hip. She stood up. The man was staring at her. "He's in pain," she said. "Left rear hip. He's been compensating for a while. You can see it in how he's distributing his weight." She glanced at his face. "How long has he been moving like this?" The man blinked. A few weeks. Maybe longer. I thought it was joint stiffness. He's 8 years old." "It's not joint stiffness." She looked at Bravo again. "What's his name? His actual call name from service?" The man's voice shifted slightly. "Bravo was his call name, unit designation K9-7. He served with me for 4 years." "What unit?" A pause. Not suspicious, though more like the pause of a man who's spent a long time being careful about what he says. "Naval Special Warfare." Natalie nodded once. Nothing in her face changed. "We need to get him into imaging. I want to look at his hip and lower spine." She looked at the man directly for the first time. "What's your name?" "Garrett Cole." "Mr. Cole, has Bravo had a full evaluation since retirement?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "He passed his exit evaluation 14 months ago. Full medical clearance." Natalie held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly professional. "Okay," she said. "Let's see what we're working with." Dr. Prescott arrived 20 minutes later, by which time Natalie had already gotten Bravo sedated, positioned, and into the imaging suite with a smoothness that had left Maya standing in the hallway doing a quiet recalibration of everything she thought she knew. Prescott was a tall man in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the careful authority of someone who had spent 30 years being the most qualified person in the room. He reviewed the preliminary intake notes Natalie had written and looked up at her over his glasses. "You sedated him without a consult?" I used the same protocol we'd use for any large working breed showing acute stress response, she said. I needed him still for imaging. I noted everything in the file. He's a retired military animal. There's liability. There's a dog in significant pain in the next room. She kept her voice level. I can show you the imaging when it's ready. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man deciding whether to push back on something he knows is probably fine. Then he turned and went to put on his coat. I'll be in imaging in 10 minutes. Natalie didn't wait for him. She pulled the first images while Bravo was still under. The portable X-ray equipment was old, required repositioning twice to get clean angles, and she did it herself rather than wait for Joel, who had a habit of rushing angles to avoid staying in the room with larger animals. She got 6 images, checked them at the workstation, and felt something cold and specific settle in her chest. She looked at them for a long time. Then she pulled them up again and looked at them a second time because she wanted to make sure she wasn't wrong. She wasn't wrong. Garrett Cole was in the waiting area. The only person there, the clinic had cleared the other morning appointments with minimal explanation. And he stood up when she appeared in the doorway. Can I sit down with you for a moment? She asked. He sat. She pulled a chair around so she wasn't across from him like a doctor delivering news, but beside him, at an angle. She set a printed image on the low table between them. This is Bravo's left hip, she said. Do you see this line here? She pointed to a diagonal fracture line across the femoral head, partially healed, irregular. Garrett leaned forward. His face went very still. That's a fracture, he said. His voice was careful. Yes, it's partially healed, which means it happened a significant time ago. Conservatively, I'd estimate 12 to 14 months. Possibly longer. The body has been trying to stabilize it, but it hasn't done it cleanly. He's been moving with this injury for over a year, compensating with his right side and his lower back, which is why you're also seeing muscle degradation here and here. She pointed to 2 more areas on the image. He's been in serious pain for a long time. He just didn't show it the way dogs are expected to show pain. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. Working dogs are trained not to show pain. I know. He went through a full exit evaluation. They said he was cleared. I know that too. He looked at her. Something had shifted in his face. Not accusation, not yet, but the beginning of a question that had no comfortable answer. So what does this mean? What does it mean that they cleared him with this? Natalie held his gaze. Mr. Cole, this injury would have been visible on any competent imaging scan 14 months ago. It's not subtle. It's not something you miss by accident. The silence between them was specific and heavy. You're saying it wasn't missed, Garrett said slowly. She didn't answer directly because she didn't have enough yet to say what she thought she knew. But she didn't look away either. I want to call in a specialist for a secondary review, she said. And I'd like you to be here for that conversation. Oh, Prescott reviewed the imaging himself 20 minutes later and had the good grace to look genuinely troubled. He asked Natalie twice how she'd identified the fracture line so quickly on equipment that was admittedly not hospital grade. She told him she'd repositioned the angles to get cleaner views of the femoral head. He nodded slowly, in the way of a man filing information without knowing where to put it yet. The specialist Natalie called was a veterinary orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Sandra Falke, who practiced out of Missoula and who Natalie had met exactly once at a continuing education conference, and whose direct mobile number she had in her phone without any explanation she'd offered to her coworkers. Falk answered on the second ring. It's Natalie Cross. I'm in Dillon. I have a retired military working dog with a partially healed femoral fracture that was missed, or not missed, in an official exit evaluation 14 months ago. I need a second set of eyes. There was a brief pause. I can be there by 2. Natalie thanked her and ended the call. She didn't notice Dana watching from the doorway of the reception area with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and the dawning unease of someone who's realized they've badly misjudged something. Joel was restacking the vitamins rack and pretending not to listen. In the kennel area, Bravo was sleeping off the sedation on a padded mat, his breathing slow and even, his massive head resting on his forepaws. Natalie checked on him, noted his vitals, adjusted the heating pad slightly. She stayed longer than she needed to, not checking anything, just sitting on the floor beside him, with her back against the kennel wall. She'd known, the moment she saw the images. Not suspected, known. She'd seen that specific injury pattern before. She'd written a report about it once, a long time ago, in a context she didn't talk about. The report had gone somewhere it shouldn't have. Then it had disappeared entirely. She rubbed the dog behind his ear, very gently. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." Assam. Falk arrived at 1:47, 40 minutes ahead of schedule. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a manner that dispensed with social formalities in the way that genuinely competent people often do. She shook Prescott's hand briefly, went directly to the imaging workstation, and didn't speak for 4 minutes. "Who read these?" she asked. "I did," Natalie said. Falk looked at her. "These repositioning angles? Standard clinic equipment?" "It's a Ceticol system, probably 10 years old. I took 6 views." "The oblique here is textbook. Better than textbook, actually. This line," Falk pointed to the fracture margin. "I wouldn't have been confident reading this on a first pass without these angles." She paused. "Where did you train?" "A beat." "Montana State Certification Program," Natalie said. Falk held her gaze for a moment and said nothing. Then she turned back to the screen. "This fracture is a minimum of 12 months old, probably 14 to 16. The bony callus formation here is substantial. He's been running on this." She shook her head slowly. If this dog went through a standard exit evaluation, someone either didn't image the hip at all, or they imaged it and signed off anyway. Garrett, who'd been standing quietly in the doorway, said, "Is there a third option?" Falk looked at him. "Not a good one." The room was quiet except for the ambient hum of the refrigerator unit and the distant sound of a truck on the highway outside. Then Garrett's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and something moved across his face that Natalie couldn't quite read. Not surprise exactly, but the expression of a man who has been expecting a call he doesn't want to receive. He stepped into the hallway. Natalie watched the empty doorway for a moment. Then she looked back at Falk. "I need to document everything," she said. "Every image, every measurement, every timestamp." "Already ahead of you," Falk said, and pulled up her own laptop. Prescott, who had been increasingly quiet as the conversation had moved past his comfort zone, said carefully, "Natalie, what exactly are we getting into here?" She looked at him. She thought about the report she'd written years ago. She thought about the email she'd gotten back, telling her the matter had been reviewed and no action was required. She thought about the way she'd left that job 3 months later, not because she'd been fired, but because she'd understood, suddenly and completely, that staying meant pretending she didn't know what she knew. "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but I'm going to find out." At 4:17 that afternoon, a black SUV with federal government plates pulled into the clinic parking lot. Natalie saw it from the supply room window. Her hands didn't stop moving. She was reorganizing the antibiotic stock, which didn't need reorganizing, which was what she did when she needed to think without looking like she was thinking. But her eyes tracked the vehicle, and she noted 2 things in rapid succession. 1, there were 2 occupants, both in civilian clothing that fit the way clothes fit on people who work in federal agencies. And 2, they didn't come in through the main entrance. They sat in the lot for 6 minutes first. Dana knocked on the supply room door frame. "Natalie, there are 2 people here asking for you." "I know," Natalie said. She finished what she was doing, set the last bottle on the shelf, and turned around. "Tell them I'll be right there." She walked to the small bathroom at the end of the hallway, ran cold water over her wrists, and looked at herself in the mirror for approximately 5 seconds. Then she dried her hands and went out. The 2 federal agents, she could see it clearly now, in their posture and the specific way they'd positioned themselves in the waiting area, with sightlines to both the front door and the hallway, stood when she appeared. The woman spoke first. She was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with the kind of face that gave away very little. "Ms. Cross? I'm Special Agent Dara Voss, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. This is my colleague, Agent Marcus Webb." She held up credentials. "We'd like to speak with you privately, if that's possible." Natalie looked at the credentials long enough to register they were real. There's a consult room in the back. She led them through the hallway, past the kennel area where Bravo was now awake and watching the movement with calm, dark eyes. Voss glanced at the dog. Webb didn't. The consult room was small. An exam table, 2 chairs, a counter with a small sink. Natalie closed the door. She didn't sit. Neither did the agents. Ms. Cross, Voss said, we're here in connection with an investigation into the military K-9 exit evaluation program operated through a DoD contracted facility in Colorado, specifically a contractor called Harwick Assessment Group. Natalie was quiet. During the course of the investigation, Voss continued, your name appeared in connection with documentation filed approximately 4 years ago. A formal complaint and internal report submitted through the Joint Working Dog Program, later marked as resolved. It wasn't resolved, Natalie said. Voss and Webb exchanged a brief look. It was the look of people who've been doing this long enough to recognize when someone confirms something faster than expected. The original report has been partially reconstructed, Webb said. He had a careful, precise way of speaking. But there are significant gaps. Records appear to have been altered. They were altered, Natalie said. The original version implicated the evaluation director and at least one senior officer in the program. The version on file now doesn't. Another look between them, this one longer. Ms. Cross, Voss said, and her voice shifted into something slightly more direct. We need to understand the full scope of what you documented 4 years ago. We also need to understand how it is that you're currently treating a K-9 that appears to have been cleared through the same evaluation program your complaint was about. Natalie looked at them for a moment. That part, she said, wasn't planned. And through the wall of the consult room, from the kennel hallway, she heard Bravo make a sound. Not a bark, not a whine, but the low, specific vocalization of a dog who has heard a familiar voice and is letting the room know he's paying attention. The agents heard it too. Voss looked at the wall, then back at Natalie. How did you know to run the imaging protocol you used today? The angles, the positioning, that's not standard veterinary nursing procedure. The question hung in the air. Natalie had spent a long time being someone who didn't answer that question. She'd made a careful practice of it. She'd built the last 2 years of her life around not being the person who answered it. But Bravo had walked into this clinic because pain will eventually make even the best trained animal stop hiding. And the truth had followed him in through the door like a draft that couldn't be closed out. She looked at Voss. She looked at Webb. No, she said. It isn't. And the silence that followed was the kind that comes just before something that's been buried for a very long time finally breaks the surface. The silence didn't last long because silence in a room with 2 federal investigators never does. Voss pulled out a small notebook. Actual paper, not a tablet, which told Natalie something about how this woman preferred to work. We're going to need you to walk us through everything, starting with when you first encountered the evaluation program. That's going to take more than one conversation, Natalie said. We have time. I don't. She moved to the door. Bravo needs a pain management protocol set before 6, and I need to discuss surgical options with Dr. Falk before she drives back to Missoula. Whatever you need from me, I'll give it to you. But not while a dog is lying in a kennel waiting for care that's 4 years overdue. Webb blinked. It was a small thing, barely perceptible, but Natalie had spent years reading rooms and she caught it. Not offense, but recalibration. He'd expected her to be more compliant. Most people were. Voss closed the notebook. 2 hours. 1.5, Natalie said. And I need Garrett Cole in the room. Another exchanged look. This one carried something she couldn't fully read. Why? Voss asked. Because Bravo is his dog, this investigation presumably involves his dog's care record, and he deserves to know what he's been living with for the last 14 months. She looked at Voss directly. And because if you plan to use anything I tell you, you should have a witness who isn't connected to either side. Voss studied her for a moment. All right. Natalie left them in the consult room and went back to Bravo. Falk had already drawn up a pain management plan by the time Natalie got to the kennel. A combination of anti-inflammatories, and a low-dose opioid adjunct that would keep Bravo comfortable without suppressing his system ahead of the surgical consultation. She walked Natalie through it quickly and efficiently, the way people do when they respect each other's competence and don't need to perform expertise for an audience. "Surgery is going to be complicated," Falk said, crouching beside the kennel door and looking at Bravo through the mesh. He looked back at her with his calm amber eyes. The aggression from this morning was completely gone, replaced by something quieter, the exhausted peace of an animal who has finally stopped pretending. "The callus formation is irregular. We'll need to remove some of it before we can stabilize the head. I want a CT before I commit to a specific approach." "How soon can you do it?" "If I can get him in next week, I can do it in Missoula. But I want him stable before transport, at minimum 48 hours on the pain protocol. See how he responds." Natalie nodded. She reached through the kennel door and let Bravo sniff her knuckles. He pressed his nose against her hand in the same deliberate way he had this morning, unhurried, like he was checking that she was still there. "Natalie," Falk's voice was lower now, not professional lower, personal lower. "The angles you took today, the way you read those images." "I repositioned the—" "Don't." Falk wasn't unkind, but she was firm. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I've trained residents. What you did today is not something you learn in a state certification program. The oblique angle you use to isolate the femoral head, that's a technique from military veterinary radiology. I've only seen it taught in 2 places." She paused. "One of them is Fort Leonard Wood." Natalie was quiet for a beat too long. "I'm not asking you to explain it to me," Falk said. "I'm telling you that I noticed, and that whatever is happening with those federal agents in your consult room, you should be careful." "I know how to be careful. I know you do." Falk stood up. "That's actually what worries me." She said she'd be back in the morning to check on Bravo before the drive back to Missoula. She shook Natalie's hand in a way that held a second longer than a professional goodbye. Then she left, and Natalie listened to her footsteps recede down the hallway and out the side door, and then she sat down on the floor outside Bravo's kennel and let herself have 90 seconds of not performing composure for anyone. 90 seconds. She'd learned a long time ago that was about all she could afford. Garrett was in the waiting room, standing at the window watching the federal SUV in the parking lot with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way of a man running calculations he doesn't like the results of. "They want to talk to both of us," Natalie said. He turned. "I know, the woman, Voss. She came and told me." He looked at Natalie with the specific directness of someone who has decided that oblique conversation is a waste of time they don't have. "Before we go in there, I need you to tell me something." "Okay." "How did you know about Bravo?" "Not the injury." "I get that. You saw it in the imaging. I mean, this morning. The command." "Ruhig." He said the word carefully, with the pronunciation of someone who knew exactly what it meant because he'd used it for 4 years. "That's not a word that appears in standard veterinary practice. That's a working dog command from a German Shepherd bloodline training program specifically used by Naval Special Warfare K9 units." Natalie held his gaze. "It's also used by Army K9 programs," she said, "and by some civilian protection dog trainers." "Sure," he said, "but you used it like you've used it before, not like you looked it up." His voice wasn't aggressive. It was the voice of a man who needs the truth more than he needs to be comfortable. "I've watched a lot of people try to handle dogs they don't understand. You didn't try. You just knew." The waiting room was empty. Dana had apparently decided the wisest course of action was to be somewhere else, and Joel had left at 5. The overhead light hummed. Through the wall, Natalie could hear Bravo shifting position in his kennel, the soft sound of his weight resettling. "I worked with military working dogs," she said. "Before this? In a different capacity." Garrett waited. "I was a trauma specialist, in a program that supported K9 recovery and reintegration after combat deployment. I worked with the dogs and with the handlers." She stopped there. He let the silence sit for a moment. "What happened to that job?" "I found something I wasn't supposed to find. I reported it. It didn't go well." She said it flatly, without self-pity, the way you state facts that have already been processed into scar tissue. "I left. I came here. Garrett uncrossed his arms. Something in his posture shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened slightly, like a door that's been deadbolted for a long time, moving a fraction of an inch. And now the thing you found is standing in your parking lot with federal plates. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Is Bravo's injury connected to what you reported? I think so. She met his eyes. I think what happened to Bravo is exactly what I warned them about 4 years ago. And I think he's not the only one. The muscle in Garrett's jaw tightened. It was a small movement. It carried a significant weight. Then let's go talk to them, he said. What? The meeting in the consult room lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than Natalie had offered, and 20 minutes less than she'd expected once the full scope of the questions became clear. Voss ran the session with the careful efficiency of someone who had done hundreds of interviews and knew that the way you asked a question shaped the answer you got. She started broad, general background, when Natalie had worked in the military K-9 support program, the name of the program, her specific role, and then narrowed incrementally, the way a surgeon narrows an incision. Natalie answered accurately and without embellishment. She'd learned years ago that precision was the best protection. Say exactly what you know, nothing more, and leave no room for things to be reinterpreted. She had worked for 3 years in a DoD contracted K-9 trauma and reintegration program based out of a facility in Colorado Springs. Her role was as a senior recovery specialist, which included post-surgical care, behavioral rehabilitation, and working alongside the exit evaluation process. The evaluation process was run by a separate contractor, Harwick Assessment Group, and the two programs had overlapping responsibilities during the transition phase, which was when she'd started noticing the discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies, Webb asked. Dogs that I'd worked with during recovery, dogs I knew had injuries that hadn't fully resolved, were being passed through evaluation with clean bills of health. Not all of them, but a pattern. She kept her voice level. I started documenting it, cross-referencing my own clinical notes with the official evaluation records. The injuries I'd observed didn't appear in the final evaluation reports. How many animals? Over a 14-month period, I identified 11 dogs. 11 cases where the evaluation record didn't match the clinical picture I'd personally documented. Garrett hadn't spoken since they sat down. He was listening with the focused stillness of a man who had spent years in environments where missing information got people killed, and Natalie could feel him processing every word she said. Voss wrote something in her notebook. You filed a formal complaint. I filed a complaint through the internal reporting structure first. That was March, 4 years ago. I was told it was being reviewed. 3 months later, I was told the review was complete and no violations had been found. She paused. At that point, I filed directly with the Joint Working Dog Program Oversight Office. That complaint included copies of my documentation. And then? A week later, I was notified that my contract was under review for unrelated performance concerns. That was the first time any performance concerns had been raised in 3 years of employment. She said it without inflection. The inflection wasn't necessary. I left voluntarily before the review concluded. And the documentation you filed? Voss asked. I kept copies. The room was very quiet. You kept copies, Webb said carefully. Personal copies. Not from the facility system. From my own contemporaneous records. The notes I took, the imaging I personally reviewed, the dates and case numbers. She looked at him evenly. I kept everything. Voss put her pen down. Just for a second, then she picked it up again. Ms. Cross, I want to be very direct with you about something. The version of your complaint currently in the system is significantly different from what you've just described. What's on file now is a vague quality concern report with no specific case documentation and a resolution note indicating the issues were reviewed and found to be unsubstantiated. There is no mention of 11 dogs, no cross-referenced clinical records, no allegations against any specific contractor. I know, Natalie said, because that isn't what I filed. Garrett spoke for the first time in over an hour. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. Someone changed the complaint. That's one conclusion, Voss said carefully. It's the correct conclusion, Natalie said. The version on file isn't a summary of what I submitted. It's a replacement. The fluorescent light above them flickered once and steadied. Somewhere down the hall, Bravo made a low sound, but not distress, just presence. Still there, still listening in his own way. Voss looked at Natalie for a long moment. Where are your copies? Secure storage, off-site. She didn't elaborate on what that meant, and they didn't push yet. We're going to need access to them. I know, I'll need to understand the scope of the investigation and who has oversight before I hand them over. She said it quietly, without apology. The last time I trusted the internal process with documentation, it disappeared. I'm not doing that again without protections in place. Webb nodded slowly. It wasn't agreement exactly. It was the nod of a man who recognizes a reasonable position even if it complicates his job. Voss closed her notebook. We'll be in contact tomorrow with the formal case structure. In the meantime, she looked at both Natalie and Garrett. We'd ask you both to be discreet about this conversation. The investigation is active, and there are parties who have reason to monitor for information leaks. Garrett looked at her with an expression that was as close to sardonic as his controlled face probably got. I spent 12 years doing jobs where loose talk had consequences I'd prefer not to describe. I think I can manage discretion. And you, Ms. Cross? Natalie thought about the 2 years she'd spent in this small clinic in Dillon, Montana, not talking to anyone about what she knew. I've been discreet, she said. For 4 years. It hasn't helped much. They left at 7:30. Natalie stood at the clinic window and watched the black SUV pull out of the lot and turn south toward the highway. The lot was empty except for her car and Garrett's green pickup, which was still there because Garrett was still there. He'd asked to stay close to Bravo for the night, and she hadn't said no. She found him in the kennel room, sitting on the floor outside Bravo's kennel with his back against the wall and his legs stretched out. Bravo had his nose pressed against the mesh, close to Garrett's shoulder. They'd found the position together, the way animals and the people they trust do without discussing it. Natalie sat down on the floor across from them. She was tired in a way that went past the physical. The specific fatigue of a day where you've had to be more of yourself than you usually allow, in front of people you didn't plan to let close. You okay? She asked. Garrett looked at Bravo. 4 years, he said. He's been hurting for 4 years, essentially. And I walked him every morning, thought I was doing right by him, thought the people who were supposed to check him had done their job. He stopped. I looked for signs. I wasn't negligent. I know. But I missed it. Working dogs don't present pain the way pet dogs do. You know that. You're trained to look for specific things. The people who were supposed to look for the right things looked and signed off anyway. She let that sit for a second. That's not your failure. Doesn't feel that way. I know. She looked at Bravo, who had moved his attention from Garrett to her, watching her with the patient assessment that she'd noticed was his dominant mode. Not aggression, not neediness, just constant quiet evaluation. He trusted the people he was supposed to trust. He just couldn't tell anyone when they got it wrong. Garrett looked at her. Is that about him or about you? It was a direct question, and it landed somewhere in the middle of her chest, and she didn't entirely have an answer for it. Maybe both, she said, which was more honest than she usually was with people she'd known for less than a day. Garrett was quiet for a while. Then he said, The 11 dogs you mentioned, do you know what happened to all of them? The question carried its own weight, and they both knew it. I know what happened to most of them, she said. A few I lost track of. After I left, I didn't have access to the records anymore. She paused. 3 of them, that I know of, didn't make it past 2 years post-retirement. The official cause in each case was listed as age-related deterioration. She said the last 3 words with a flatness that communicated exactly what she thought of them. Garrett absorbed that. His face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes went very still. Bravo's 8, he said. Bravo got lucky. He got lucky that you noticed something was wrong, and luckier still that you ended up here instead of a clinic that would have told you it was arthritis and sent you home with supplements. He looked at her. Why'd you stay? In Dillon? In this work. If you knew what you knew, if you'd tried to report it and gotten burned, why stay in veterinary medicine at all? Why not do something else entirely? It was the kind of question that people asked when they were actually asking something else, and Natalie had learned to hear the real question underneath. He wasn't asking why she stayed in the field. He was asking what she was still holding on to. Because the dogs didn't stop needing help because the people in charge of helping them were corrupt, she said. That's the only reason I've ever needed. Garrett held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at Bravo. They stayed like that for a while, not talking, just occupying the same space in the way that people do when they've gone through something that hasn't finished going through them yet, and being alone with it would be worse. At 11 that night, after Garrett had finally gone to a motel down the road, and Natalie had done a final check on Bravo's vitals and locked up, she sat in her car in the empty clinic lot for 12 minutes before she turned the key. She was thinking about the agents, about what they'd said about the altered complaint, about the word they'd used, active. The investigation was active, which meant they'd already found enough to open it, which meant someone had already been talking, which meant the people who'd buried her report 4 years ago were probably aware by now that the burial hadn't held. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to a number saved under a first name only. A woman named Ressa, who had worked alongside her in Colorado Springs and who she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. The text said, "They found me. I think it's finally moving. Are you safe?" She waited. 3 minutes. 5. At the 7-minute mark, the 3 typing dots appeared. Then they stopped. Then they appeared again. Then the message came through, and Natalie read it, and the skin on the back of her neck went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the Montana night. It said, "I've been trying to reach you for 2 weeks. They've been to my house, Nat, not the investigators. The other ones. You need to check your clinic security footage from the last 48 hours. Natalie looked up from her phone. She looked at the clinic building, at the dark windows, at the side door she'd just locked. She looked at the roof line and the corner of the parking lot where the lot lamp was dark. Had been dark for 2 weeks, she realized, and she'd noticed it without registering it. And at the black car parked on the far side of the street that she had not seen arrive and could not, from this angle, see clearly enough to make out the plates. She put the car in reverse slowly, without turning the headlights on. And then the clinic's interior alarm system, which she had personally armed 20 minutes ago, went off. The alarm was a single sustained tone. Not the panic siren of a break-in, but the internal motion sensor, the one covering the back corridor and the kennel area. Natalie had her phone to her ear before she'd fully processed the decision to call. Garrett picked up on the second ring. "The clinic alarm just triggered," she said. "Interior motion, back corridor." A beat of silence. She heard him moving. "I'm 4 minutes out. Don't come in through the front, side lot, the maintenance door. I'll meet you there." She was already out of the car, keys in her fist with 2 of them between her fingers. Not a weapon, just habit. Just the automatic preparation of someone who had lived for years in the careful middle ground between vigilance and paranoia. And Garrett, Bravo is in the kennel. If someone's in there with him, 4 minutes, he said, and ended the call. She went to the side door first, not the front, because the front had windows that let the street see in, and she didn't want the black car, if someone was still in it, to track her position. The maintenance door had a separate keypad, and she punched the code in the dark by feel, got it wrong the first time because her hands were moving faster than her brain, made herself slow down, got it right. The door opened into the supply corridor. She stood in the dark for 3 seconds and listened. The alarm had stopped. The auto shut-off kicked in after 90 seconds for the motion sensors, per the system's setting, which she'd always considered a flaw and now considered a particular problem. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that has something behind it. She moved down the corridor, keeping her shoulder close to the wall, not running, just quick and deliberate, because running in the dark in an unfamiliar situation was how you ran into the thing you were trying to assess. The kennel was at the end. The light in the kennel area was on a separate switch from the main corridor. She could see the faint glow of the nightlights under the door. She pushed it open. Bravo was standing in his kennel, weight distributed, ears forward. He was facing the far wall, not the door she'd come through, but the exterior wall, the one that had a window mounted high up for ventilation. The window was small, too small for a person, but it was open, on its hinge, 2 inches more than she'd left it. She stood very still and looked at the window. Then she looked at the kennel floor where Bravo's water bowl had been pushed aside, and at the base of the exterior wall where something small and rectangular sat on the concrete in the shadow beneath the window. She crossed the room and crouched down without touching it. It was a phone. A prepaid by the look of it. the kind with the plastic casing and minimal branding. The screen was dark, but she could see it wasn't powered off. The indicator light was pulsing once every 3 seconds. It had been put there deliberately, through the window. She looked at Bravo. He looked back at her. Still forward-facing, still alert, but calm. He'd watched someone push this through the gap and hadn't reacted the way he'd react to a genuine threat, which meant whoever left it hadn't tried to enter. They'd just delivered something and left. She heard the maintenance door open at the end of the corridor and Garrett's footsteps. She recognized them already, the particular weight distribution of a man who'd been trained to move quietly and now couldn't fully unlearn it. And she called out, "Kennel, I'm okay." He appeared in the doorway, assessed the room in under 2 seconds, and looked at the phone on the floor. He said nothing. "Someone put it through the window," she said, "while I was in the parking lot." Garrett crouched beside her and looked at the phone without touching it either. "They were watching you leave. They waited until you were outside, put this through, and triggered the motion sensor on purpose. To get me back in here." She looked at the pulsing light. "They want me to pick it up. So someone knows you're connected to this, and it's not the federal investigators." "No." She looked at the window again. "This is the other side." Garrett's jaw set. He stood up slowly. "What do you want to do?" Natalie looked at the phone for another few seconds. Then she took a pen from her breast pocket, used it to flip the device over without touching the casing, and pressed the side button with the pen's tip to wake the screen. One message. No sender ID. It said, "The storage unit in Harwick's name, 4400 Meridian Road, Breckton, CO. Unit 17, they're moving the records tomorrow morning. If they go, this is over." She read it twice, then she took a photo of the screen with her own phone. "Someone on the inside is trying to help," Garrett said, reading over her shoulder. "Or someone on the inside is trying to get me to go somewhere specific so I'm not here." She straightened up. "Could be either." "How do you want to play it?" She called Voss. The agent answered in 3 rings, which meant she was still awake, which meant she'd expected something. Natalie read her the message verbatim. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to carry information. "Do not go to that address," Voss said. "Do you understand me? This is not a request." "I wasn't planning to. I'm sending you the photo now." She did. "I also need to tell you that whoever left this has been watching the clinic. They accessed the exterior of the building, put a device through a ventilation window, and left without triggering anything except the interior motion sensor. That's not random." "How confident are you that the building is clear?" "I'm in the building. I can tell you that the back corridor is clear, and the kennel is clear. I haven't checked the front." "Get out," Voss said. "Both of you. Take the dog if you can move him safely. Do not stay in that building tonight." Natalie looked at Bravo. He was still standing, still watching her. The pain medication had taken the edge off his discomfort, but he wasn't mobile the way he'd need to be for any kind of quick movement. Transporting him tonight, sedated and post-protocol, would require equipment she didn't have here and a destination with proper facilities. "The dog is post-sedation and on pain management. I can't move him tonight without risking the hip further." A pause. "Then we need someone on site. Give me 20 minutes." Voss ended the call. Garrett looked at her. "She's sending someone." "Yes." "Which means the investigation is further along than they showed us this afternoon." "That was my read too." He looked at Bravo again. The dog had lowered himself carefully onto the mat, all his weight going to his right side, the compensatory habit so ingrained that even the pain medication hadn't fully unlocked it yet. He settled with his head up, watching them both with that particular steady alertness that was just who he was all the time, regardless of what his body was doing. "He's not going to let anything happen to this place tonight," Garrett said. It wasn't sentimental. It was an assessment. "I know," Natalie said. "Neither are we." Sham. 2 federal vehicles arrived in 22 minutes. Not the same black SUV from the afternoon, but unmarked white pickups that blended into rural Montana the way the SUV hadn't, which told her something about how this operation had been structured from the beginning. 2 agents she hadn't met took positions at the front and rear of the building. Voss arrived in a 3rd vehicle, came inside, and walked the building personally before she said anything else to Natalie. In the consult room, the same one from earlier, which was starting to feel like a recurring location in a situation Natalie hadn't asked to star in, Voss spread out 3 printed documents on the exam table. Harwick Assessment Group, she said. The founder and primary evaluator is a man named Dex Harwick, former military veterinary officer, left service 12 years ago, set up the private contract operation within 18 months of his separation. The DoD contract for K9 exit evaluations was awarded to his company 7 years ago and has been renewed 3 times. Natalie looked at the documents. The name Dex Harwick was not new to her. She'd heard it in meetings, seen it on evaluation forms, understood vaguely that he was the person whose signature appeared at the bottom of the clearance paperwork. She hadn't known until much later that he was also the person who'd received her complaint before it moved up the chain. Or hadn't moved up the chain. The storage facility and the message, Natalie said. Is it real? We're verifying. If it is real and if there are records there, they'd be potentially significant. But I need you to understand. Voss looked at her directly. If this message was sent to lure you or us to that location, and if Harwick's people are monitoring whether we respond to it, then any action we take has to be handled in a way that doesn't tip our hand. So you're not going in tonight. We're positioning assets, but no direct entry tonight. Voss tapped one of the documents. What I need from you now is the secure storage you mentioned this afternoon, your copies of the original documentation. I need to know what we have before I decide how to move on Harwick. This was the moment Natalie had been thinking about since the afternoon. She'd thought about it while she sat on the floor with Bravo, while she sat in the parking lot, while she stood in the dark of the back corridor with her keys between her fingers. She'd run the calculation on it the way you run calculations on things you've been avoiding. I have documentation covering 11 cases, she said. Clinical notes, imaging records, case numbers, dates of evaluation, specific evaluator signatures, and the discrepancies between my clinical observations and the official clearance paperwork. She paused. I also have email correspondence from the week after I filed the original complaint, including an email from Dex Harwick directly. Voss was very still. An email from Harwick. He contacted me personally, presented it as a professional courtesy, said he understood I had concerns, wanted to discuss them through proper channels, said the complaint review was progressing appropriately. She let the next part land with the weight it deserved. That email was sent 4 days before my contract was flagged for review, and it contains language that, in context, reads as a very carefully worded suggestion that I should let the matter drop. Webb, who had been standing by the door, spoke for the first time. Do you still have it? Everything I described is in a secure archive, encrypted, off-site in 2 locations. She looked at Voss. I'll give you access on one condition. What condition? I want to be present when you go through it. Not to control what you find. You can have everything. I'm not holding anything back. But I spent 4 years watching this material sit in the wrong hands and disappear. I need to see it go into the right ones. Voss didn't hesitate. Agreed. The next 8 hours moved in the specific way that serious things move when there's no room for anything except what needs to happen next. Not fast, exactly, but without any wasted motion. Natalie called up the encrypted archive from her phone's secure app, walked Voss and Webb through the file structure, and watched 2 federal investigators work through 4 years of documentation she'd maintained alone in the careful certainty that someday this conversation would happen. They were thorough. They asked good questions. They flagged the things she'd expected them to flag, and a few things she hadn't. At 3 a.m., Webb found a case she'd numbered as a secondary concern, a dog she'd designated as Case 7, a Malinois named Sabre, and he sat forward and asked her to walk him through the clinical notes in detail. She did. Sabre had come through the recovery program 18 months before Bravo. Similar injury pattern, left hip, partially resolved trauma, movement compensation. She'd flagged it in her records, documented the discrepancy with the clearance report, included it in her original complaint. Case 7's evaluation was signed by Harwick personally, Webb said. Yes. The others, some were signed by his deputy evaluator. Yes. But Case 7, Harwick signed directly, and Case 7's retirement was fast-tracked. The standard timeline is 90 days between final evaluation and official separation. Case 7 was done in 22 days. Natalie looked at the document. She'd noted the timeline at the time, flagged it as irregular, but hadn't known what it meant. Why would he fast-track one dog specifically? Webb looked at Voss. It was a look that communicated something she wasn't in on yet. Because Case 7's handler, Voss said, was a Navy lieutenant named Marcus Reel, who is now a congressional aide to the Senate Armed Services Committee. The room was very quiet. Someone with leverage, Natalie said slowly, or someone who knew something, or someone who was being given a clean dog to keep them quiet. Voss tapped the table lightly. We don't know which yet, but it's a thread. Natalie thought about threads, about the way a single pulled thread, if you found the right one, could unravel something that looked solid from a distance. There's one more thing in the archive, she said, a document I almost didn't keep. I wasn't sure it was relevant at the time. She navigated to a folder she'd labeled simply as My C, Retain. After I left Colorado Springs, about 6 weeks later, I received a physical letter, paper, printed, no signature, mailed to my forwarding address. She pulled up the scanned copy. It's a list, she said. 17 case numbers. I cross-referenced them against my own documentation. 9 of them matched dogs I'd worked with. The other 8 I didn't have direct contact with, but the numbering structure is consistent with the same program's case system. Voss leaned forward and looked at the list on the screen. Who sent this? I don't know. I never found out. But it was mailed within 6 weeks of my departure, which means someone who knew I'd left, someone still inside, chose to send this to me. She looked at Voss. Someone who knew my documentation only covered 11 cases wanted me to know the real number was higher. Webb said, very quietly, 17. Possibly more. 17 is what they knew about, or what they were willing to put on paper. She looked at the list. 3 of the case numbers on this letter correspond to dogs I know are deceased. Yet, at 6:40 in the morning, Voss's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway to take it and was gone for 4 minutes. When she came back, her face had the particular controlled neutrality of someone managing significant new information while other people were watching. The Breckton address is real, she said. Unit 17 has a current rental in a name that's a registered subsidiary of Harwick Assessment Group. And as of 40 minutes ago, a vehicle registered to that subsidiary made 2 trips between a location in Colorado Springs and the Breckton facility. They're moving something. Garrett, who had been sitting in the corner since 2 a.m. and who Natalie had mostly forgotten was there until he spoke, said, They know you're close. Someone does, Voss said. The person who left that phone, Natalie said. They triggered the alarm deliberately. They weren't just delivering a message, they were timing it. They wanted us to contact you, get your attention on the Breckton location, because they knew what was going to happen there. They're trying to help us, Garrett said. They're trying to hand us something before it disappears, Natalie said. That's not the same thing necessarily, but the result is the same. She looked at Voss. What are you going to do? Voss looked at her phone, at the document on the screen, at the window where the Montana sky was starting to go gray at the edges with early light. We're executing a warrant on the Breckton location in, she checked her watch, approximately 2 hours. We've had it ready for 48 hours. This just gives us confidence we're not walking into an empty room. And Harwick? Harwick is currently at a hotel in Denver. We have eyes on him. Voss looked at Natalie. He doesn't know we have your documentation. He thinks the original complaint is still the altered version in the system. As far as he knows, what you have is worthless because it contradicts the official record. And the official record is what he controls. He's wrong about that, Natalie said. Yes. For the first time, something that might have been satisfaction crossed Voss's face. He is. At 8 a.m., Natalie checked Bravo's vitals, adjusted the pain protocol slightly, and fed him the prescription food Falk had approved the night before. He ate slowly, but he ate, which was a better sign than she'd expected given the day he'd had. She sat with him while he finished and then stayed a few minutes more because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't the consult room for a little while. Garrett came in at 8:20 with 2 cups of coffee from the gas station a block down. He handed her one without comment. They sat in silence for a while, the way people do when there's been too much conversation and the thing that needs to happen next is out of their hands. "The 17 dogs," Garrett said eventually. "Yes." "If Harwick's been doing this for 7 years, don't do that math right now," she said. It wasn't dismissive. It was the voice of someone who had already done that math, at 4 a.m. in a different year, and knew what it cost to sit with the number. He was quiet for a moment. "Okay." Then Voss appeared in the doorway, and her expression said that the 48 hours they'd been expecting to have before this came to a head had just gotten significantly shorter. "We have a problem," she said. "Harwick checked out of his hotel. As of 7 minutes ago, his phone went dark, and the vehicle we had eyes on is gone. We have a secondary location we're moving on, but," she looked at Natalie, "we need your archive transferred to a federal server right now, all of it. If he's running, we need what you have on record before there's any possibility of—" "I know," Natalie said. She was already standing. "I know. Let's go." She was halfway down the corridor when her own phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out without slowing down. It was a text from the same number she'd texted last night. Ressa. It said, "Nat, the man who buried your complaint 4 years ago. His name isn't in your files because he never put it in writing. But I have his name. I've always had it. I just didn't know if I could trust anyone enough to say it. I'm ready. Call me." Natalie stopped walking. She read the message again. Then she looked up at Voss, who had stopped 2 steps ahead and was watching her. "There's a witness," Natalie said. "Someone who knows the name of the person who altered the complaint. Someone who has never come forward." She held up her phone. "She's ready to talk." Voss stared at her. "Who is she?" "Her name is Ressa Dolan. She worked in program administration. She would have had access to the complaint filing system." Natalie's voice was completely level. "I never asked her what she knew because I didn't want to put her in danger. She worked there for another 2 years after I left." "Where is she now?" "I don't know." Natalie looked at the text again. "She said they've been to her house. Not your people. The other ones." The sound Voss made was quiet and very specific. "Call her, right now. We need her location." Natalie was already dialing when the clinic's front door opened. Not the agent's entrance, not the side door, but the main front door with its bell that had rung exactly once that morning already, and Dana's voice came from the reception area, confused and uncertain. There are men outside. They're not showing badges. They're just..." Natalie and Voss looked at each other for a single sharp second, and then both of them were moving. The front window of the reception area showed 2 men in the parking lot, not in uniform, not in anything official, just standing near the entrance in the particular way of people who want to be seen and want you to know they're not required to explain themselves. Natalie got to the reception area in 4 steps. Dana was behind the desk with her back against the filing cabinet, her face the face of someone who has just understood that today was not going to be a normal Tuesday. "Go to the kennel room," Natalie said. "Lock the interior door. Don't come out until I or Agent Voss tell you." Dana moved. She didn't ask questions, which Natalie noted and appreciated. Voss was already on her radio. The actual radio, not her phone, which told Natalie the cell situation outside had changed in some way. She was talking in the shorthand of someone reporting a situation developing faster than the timeline allowed for. The 2 agents from the perimeter positions were visible through the window now, moving from the sides of the building toward the front. The men in the parking lot saw them. One of them reached into his jacket. "Do not draw," Voss said, loud, clear, directed at her own agents. Then into the radio. "Stand by. Visual on subjects. No hostile action confirmed. Stand by." Natalie looked at the 2 men. They were not military, or not recently. One was heavy-set, mid-50s, with the build of someone who had once been very fit and had let a decade soften it. The other was younger, maybe 35, and held very still in the way of a person who has been trained not to flinch. The older one held something up. It caught the morning light. A badge. Not federal. Natalie couldn't read the issuing agency from where she stood. "Private contractor ID?" Voss said from beside her, close enough that she could hear the controlled anger in it. "They're not law enforcement." "But they know exactly what law enforcement presence looks like, and they're not leaving," Natalie said. "No." Voss looked at them for another 2 seconds. Then she went outside. Natalie stayed at the window and watched Voss walk up to the two men with the body language of someone who had done this exact thing before and found it neither intimidating nor interesting. She spoke. The older man spoke back. The exchange lasted 90 seconds. Then the younger man said something, and Voss turned her head toward him with the expression of a person deciding whether to treat a statement as worth responding to. She said something short. She pointed toward the road. The two men left. They didn't hurry. They made sure the leaving was clearly voluntary. But they left. Voss came back inside, and her jaw was set in a way it hadn't been before. They work for a legal firm out of Denver, contracted by Harwick's parent company, which has a corporate attorney who apparently makes very fast phone calls. She looked at Natalie. They were here to observe and document who was in this building. That's it. Or that's what they'll say it was. Completely legal. But it was also a message, Natalie said. Yes. Harwick knows we're here, which means our window on the Breckton location just closed. She pulled out her phone. I need to make 3 calls. You need to get your friend Ressa Dolan on the line right now. Ressa answered on the first ring this time. She was in Laramie, Wyoming, a city she had moved to 9 months ago, she said, because she had been trying to put enough distance between herself and Colorado Springs to feel safe, which had not entirely worked, but had at least given her a few hours' warning when someone she didn't know drove past her apartment 3 times on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks ago. Her voice on the phone was steadier than Natalie had expected. Ressa had always been steady, even during the worst of what had happened at the program, not because she was unaffected, but because steadiness was the thing she'd learned to hold on to when everything else was moving. You have a name, Natalie said. I have a name. A breath. And I have something else. I have a copy of the access log from the complaint management system, the one that shows who opened your original filing, who edited it, and when. Natalie felt something very specific go still in her chest. How do you have that? Because when I realized what they'd done to your complaint, I pulled the log before anyone thought to restrict my access. I was still in administration. Ressa stopped. I was scared, Nat. I kept it because I thought someday it would matter. And then I was scared to use it because I thought they'd know it came from me. They might still. I know. I made that calculation a long time ago. I've just been waiting for the right time. A pause. I think this is the right time. The name, Ressa. The silence lasted 2 seconds, then, his name is Brigadier General Clifton Mara. He was the senior officer overseeing the Joint Working Dog Program at the time you filed. Your complaint passed through his office on its way up the chain. It didn't pass further. Natalie said nothing for a moment. She knew the name. She'd known it the same way you know the name of a building you've worked near but never entered, as architecture, not as a person. Mar had been a visible figure in the program, his name on memoranda, his office referenced in administrative communications. She had never had direct contact with him. She hadn't needed to. He's the one who buried it, she said. The access log shows his credentials were used to open your filing 3 times. The third access, 3 days after you submitted it, is when the content changed, and then his credentials closed the file with a resolution notation. Ressa's voice was careful and precise. Whether he did it personally or directed someone to do it, his credentials are on every action. Mar is still in the military? Natalie asked. He retired 14 months ago, with full honors. The particular flatness in those last 2 words carried everything it needed to carry. He's on the board of 2 defense contractor advisory groups. Natalie looked up and found Voss watching her from across the room. She put the call on speaker. Agent Voss, she said, this is Ressa Dolan. She has a name and she has the access log. What followed was not dramatic in the way that the previous 15 hours had been dramatic. It was the procedural drama of things moving into position, calls being made, warrants being expedited through channels that required the specific authority that Voss apparently had access to when she used a particular tone and a particular case number. Ressa sent the access log file to a secure federal upload portal while still on the call. Webb received it at his end and was quiet for approximately 30 seconds while he reviewed it, a silence that communicated more than commentary would have. Natalie sat in the consult room and waited. She was not good at waiting. She had managed it for 4 years by keeping herself occupied with work that mattered. The daily physical reality of caring for animals, the procedural rhythms of a clinic, the small, decisive actions that added up to a day that felt purposeful even when the larger purpose was locked in a secure archive doing nothing. But that had been waiting with her back turned. This was waiting while watching the thing happen, and it was a different experience entirely. Garrett brought her another coffee at some point. She drank half of it. He sat across from her without talking, which was, she had come to understand in the past 24 hours, one of his better qualities. At 10:17 a.m., Voss came into the consult room and sat down. The Brechton warrant executed at 10 o'clock, she said. Unit 17 was not empty. Natalie looked at her. Physical records? Filing boxes. 12 of them, and 2 external hard drives. Voss paused. The vehicle that made the runs from Colorado Springs last night apparently delivered rather than removed. Someone was consolidating. Harwick was trying to get everything in one place before he moved it, Garrett said. That's one theory. Voss looked at the table. The other theory is that whoever put that phone in your kennel last night didn't just want to alert us to the location. They wanted us to get there before Harwick could. They were protecting the records, Natalie said. Or they were protecting themselves by making sure those records became a federal matter before they could be destroyed. Voss wasn't dismissive about the distinction. She made it the way a careful person makes distinctions, because they matter. Either way, the records are secured now. We'll know more once our forensic team goes through them. Natalie thought about the prepaid phone still sitting in the kennel on the concrete floor where she'd left it, bagged now and tagged as evidence. She thought about whoever had stood outside in the Montana night, chosen a window, calculated the timing down to the motion sensor's 90-second shutoff, and pushed a device through with information that could bring down a 7-year operation. Someone still inside that system had made a decision last night that was not reversible. She hoped they were somewhere safe. She had no way to know. Clifton Marr, she said. What's his status? We've been in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Given the evidence in Ressa Dolan's access log, we have grounds to bring him in for questioning. He's in Washington, D.C. currently. Voss looked at Natalie with an expression that was as close to candid as she'd gotten in their entire acquaintance. This is going to get complicated at that level. A retired general with board positions and connections to the Senate Armed Services Committee. The U.S. Attorney is going to be careful. Careful as in slow? Garrett asked. Careful as in thorough. Which isn't slow, it's right. Voss looked at him. The case has to be airtight. If we move on Mara and anything is procedurally wrong, he has the resources to make it disappear a second time. So what do we do? Natalie asked. You've already done it, Voss said. The archive, the access log, Ressa Dolan's testimony, the Brechton records, the physical evidence in Bravo's imaging. It's a case. A real one. She paused. What we do now is let it work. Harwick was located at 12:44 p.m. at a private airfield outside Pueblo, Colorado, where a chartered aircraft had been arranged under a subsidiary company name. The timing suggested he'd made the decision to run sometime the previous evening, whether triggered by awareness of the investigation's progress or by the activity at Brechton, they didn't know yet. The aircraft hadn't departed. Federal agents met it on the tarmac. Natalie heard about it from Voss in the same matter-of-fact tone that Voss used for everything, and she received it the same way. Not with the relief she would have expected 4 years ago, when the idea of this moment had been something she'd imagined in various forms to get herself through difficult nights. The actual moment was smaller than that, more procedural. A man was in federal custody. The charges being prepared were significant. The story was not over, but one chapter of it had ended on a tarmac in Colorado with no drama and no last-minute escape. He'll have attorneys by tonight, Voss said. I know. The attorneys will challenge the archive documentation, the access log, the chain of custody on the Brechton records. I know. This is going to take time. Agent Voss, Natalie said. I've been waiting 4 years. I'm familiar with time. Something crossed Voss's face. Not quite a smile, but the first thing that had come close to one in a long acquaintance. Yes. I imagine you are. Well, the clinic did not return to normal. It wasn't possible for it to return to something it hadn't been before Tuesday morning, and nobody pretended otherwise. Prescott came in at noon, heard a summary that Natalie gave him standing in the hallway because she didn't have the energy for the formality of a meeting, and sat down heavily in his office chair with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a person he thought he knew. "You've been here 2 years," he said. 22 months. "And before that you were—" "I worked in K-9 trauma and recovery for the military. Before that I did 18 months of emergency veterinary response in 2 overseas locations supporting deployed units. Before that, I did my formal training." She said it in the same tone she'd used to read a medication dosage. "I've never misrepresented my credentials to you. I have the certifications I listed. I have other training and experience I didn't list because it wasn't relevant to the position." Prescott was quiet for a moment. "Was it relevant today?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Are you going to leave?" The question surprised her. She thought about it honestly, which meant taking 3 seconds before answering instead of defaulting to whatever was easiest. "I don't know yet. I need to get through what's coming first." He nodded again. "Whatever you need. In terms of time, access to the facility, anything the investigators need from us." He looked at his desk. "I should have asked you more questions 2 years ago." "Probably," she said, "but I wouldn't have answered them." He looked up. "I needed a job where people didn't ask questions for a while," she said. "You gave me that. Unintentionally, but still." She went back to work. Because Bravo needed his afternoon medication, and there were 2 other animals in the kennel that needed attention, and the clinic didn't stop requiring care because the world had reorganized itself overnight. At 3 p.m., Falk called from Missoula. She'd seen the news alert, a federal contractor arrest in Colorado, brief on details, the kind of item that appeared in the defense industry trade press before it made broader news. She'd connected it, apparently, without being told to. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," Natalie said. "Bravo's responding well to the pain protocol. I'd like to discuss transport timeline for the surgery." A pause. Then Falk let her redirect it without pushing. 48 hours on the current protocol, then we reassess. If his inflammatory markers are where I want them, we can talk about a careful transport. I'll have the surgical team on standby. "Thank you." "Natalie." Falk's voice shifted again into that personal register. "What you did, keeping those records for 4 years, keeping them intact, I want you to know that as someone who works with these animals, that matters to me." Natalie didn't know exactly what to do with that, which meant she said something inadequate. "I just kept the files." "No," Falk said. "You kept the truth. Those are different things." She ended the call, and Natalie stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone in her hand and something pulling tightly across her sternum that was not pain exactly, but was not nothing either. Ressa arrived in Dillon at 6:30 that evening. She'd driven from Laramie, 5 hours, because she had decided, she said, that giving testimony over a secure video line was not how she wanted to do this. She wanted to be in the room. She was 41, slight, with close-cut hair, and the kind of eyes that had seen things and filed them methodically rather than trying to unsee them. She and Natalie had not seen each other in 4 years, and they embraced in the parking lot in the particular way of people who have shared something significant and then been apart long enough that the reunion carries both warmth and the weight of everything that happened in between. "You look tired," Ressa said. "You drove 5 hours." "I slept in Rollins for 2 of them." She looked at the clinic building. "Is he in there? The dog?" "Yes." "Can I see him?" They went in through the side door, and Natalie led her back to the kennel. Bravo looked at Ressa with the same careful assessment he gave everyone, then apparently filed her as non-threatening and put his head back down. Ressa crouched in front of the kennel and looked at him for a long moment. "He's beautiful," she said quietly. "He's in pain, but less than yesterday." Ressa reached a finger through the mesh. Bravo sniffed it, considered, and then rested his chin on his forepaw in the way of a dog who is making a provisional peace. "I should have come forward sooner," Ressa said. She wasn't saying it to Natalie exactly. She was saying it to the space in general, the way you say things you've held for too long when you finally put them down. You came forward when you could, Natalie said. That's a kind way to say I waited 4 years. I waited 4 years too. I just did it with more documentation. Natalie sat down on the floor outside the kennel, which had become, in the past 36 hours, a recurring location for conversations that needed to happen somewhere grounded. Ressa, the name on the access log, Mar, did you always know it was him? Ressa sat down beside her. I suspected. I confirmed it when I pulled the log. I knew if I said anything with just suspicion and no evidence, I'd end up where you ended up. And I had a daughter. I needed to not end up where you ended up. Natalie didn't say anything. It was a reason that didn't require defense. Is she okay? Natalie asked. Your daughter. She's 11. She's great. She thinks I'm in Montana for work. Ressa looked at Bravo again. She's not entirely wrong. Deb. The formal interview with Ressa took 3 hours the following morning. Voss and Webb were thorough and Ressa was precise, and by the time it concluded, the access log had been formally entered into evidence with accompanying testimony that removed any ambiguity about its meaning. Clifton Marr's credentials, on the date and time documented, had accessed Natalie's original complaint, had accessed it 3 times, had executed the edit that replaced the detailed, case-specific documentation with a vague summary, had closed the file with a resolution notation, all of it time-stamped, all of it attached to his authenticated credentials, all of it now in federal hands. Webb, reviewing the submission, said, "The log also shows a secondary access. 12 minutes after Marr's credentials closed the file, a different user opened it. Read-only access, no edits." Natalie looked at the notation. The secondary user's ID resolved to a mid-level administrative account she didn't recognize. "That's who sent me the letter," she said. 12 minutes after the complaint was buried, someone opened it and read the original version before it was replaced. She looked at Voss. "They read what I actually wrote, and then 6 weeks after I left, they mailed me a list of 17 case numbers." Voss looked at the log notation. "We'll need to identify that account." "You will," Natalie said, "but I don't want them charged with anything. Whatever access they weren't supposed to have, they used it to try to make something right." She held Voss's gaze. "I'm not going to let the only person in that organization who tried to help me get caught in this." "That's not entirely your decision." "No, but it's a request. On the record." Voss held her gaze for a moment. "On the record." The news hit 3 days later. Not in the form Natalie had expected. She'd thought it would be a press release, a formal statement, the bureaucratic translation of an arrest into public language. Instead, it broke through the defense industry trade press first. Federal contractor accused of systematic fraud in military working dog evaluation program. Then the wire services picked it up. Then by the afternoon, the mainstream outlets had it, and they had enough to make it specific. Dex Harwick Assessment Group, 17-year contract, federal charges of procurement fraud, falsification of government records, and failure to provide adequate care to government animals. The last charge was the one that got traction in the general news cycle, because people understood it in a way they didn't always understand procurement fraud. 17 dogs, at minimum. More being investigated. Some deceased. Natalie was at the clinic when the first reporter called the main line. She let it go to voicemail. The second call she also let go. By the fourth call, Dana was fielding them with the practiced neutrality of someone who had discovered an unexpected aptitude for stonewalling media inquiries. Garrett came in mid-afternoon and showed her something on his phone, a post from a Veterans Network forum, a long thread started by a K9 handler trying to understand if his dog's health issues after retirement were connected to what was being reported. The thread had 300 replies. "There are others," he said. "I know. People who had no idea that the evaluation process could have failed their dogs. I know." She looked at the thread without reading the individual posts because she couldn't read them right now and do the work in front of her at the same time, and the work in front of her was what she had. That's why it mattered that it got out. He put the phone in his pocket. Bravo's inflammation markers came back this morning. Falk's team said they're within range for transport. I saw. So we're doing this. Thursday, she said. Falk has the surgical suite reserved. I'll ride with you and supervise the transport positioning. He looked at her. You don't have to do that. I know. Natalie. He said her name in a way that meant he was putting down the practical conversation and picking up a different one. For what it's worth, what you did 4 years ago and what you did this week, it matters to every handler who trusted that system. She looked at him for a moment. He meant it. It was visible in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that he delivered things, without performance, without the softening that people usually applied to statements like that to make them easier to say. I know, she said. I'm glad it's done. She went back to Bravo, who needed his afternoon check, and left Garrett standing in the hallway with the particular expression of a man who has more to say and has decided this is not the moment to say it. On the 4th day after Harwick's arrest, Clifton Marr's attorney issued a public statement saying that the general categorically denied any wrongdoing and that the access log evidence had been taken out of context. The statement was careful and the language was precise, and it communicated the confidence of someone who had resources and expected to deploy them effectively. 6 hours later, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington announced that Brigadier General Clifton Marr, retired, had been informed he was a subject of the investigation. Not a witness, a subject. Natalie read the notification on her phone at 9 p.m., sitting in her car in the clinic parking lot in approximately the same spot she'd sat 4 nights ago when the alarm had gone off and everything had started moving. The sky was clear and very dark, and the first stars were coming in over the mountains to the west. She thought about the woman who had sent her a list of 17 case numbers in an unsigned letter. Wherever that woman was, and Voss's team had not yet identified her, or if they hadn't told Natalie, she hoped she was watching the news. She hoped she knew that the thing she'd done, the small, terrified act of reading a buried document and writing down the numbers and putting them in an envelope, had been part of what made this possible. She put her car in drive and started home. She was 2 blocks from the clinic when her phone rang through the car speakers. Unknown number. Colorado area code. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. The voice on the other end was male, mid-range, with the careful cadence of someone reading from something prepared. Miss Cross, I'm calling on behalf of a party who prefers not to be identified at this time. You've been given partial information about the scope of this investigation. The party I represent believes you should have the complete picture before you provide further testimony. A pause. Specifically, the evidence recovered at the Breckton facility includes documentation that implicates parties beyond Harwick and Marr. Some of those parties are individuals you trusted. You need to know that before you speak again. Natalie pulled to the side of the road. Who are you? She said. That's not important right now. What's important is that the access log you provided shows 2 people in Marr's office handled your complaint. You've been told about the primary access. You haven't been told about the 3rd set of credentials. His voice was still careful, still reading. The 3rd access, which occurred between Marr's access and the secondary read-only access, belongs to an account registered to an individual named Sandra Falk. The car was very quiet. That's not possible, Natalie said. Her voice came out steady. She wasn't sure how. The federal investigation has the full log. You've been given a partial version. A pause. I suggest you ask Agent Voss why. The call ended. Natalie sat on the side of the road in the dark and listened to the silence and thought about Sandra Falk saying the oblique angle you use to isolate the femoral head. That's a technique from military veterinary radiology with the knowledge of someone who had seen it before, in a context she hadn't mentioned, and whose direct mobile number Natalie had in her phone from a conference they'd attended together 3 years ago, 1 year after Natalie had left Colorado Springs. 1 year after Natalie's complaint had been buried. And the cold thing that settled over her then was not quite certainty and not quite doubt, but something between them. The specific suspended state of a person who has just realized that the ground beneath them is not the solid surface they believed it to be, and is waiting to find out if it will hold. She sat on the side of that road for 6 minutes before she moved. Not frozen, thinking. There was a difference, and she'd learned a long time ago to know which one she was doing. Frozen was what happened when fear overtook processing. This was the other thing, the rapid, uncomfortable work of reassembling what she thought she knew against what she'd just been told. Sandra Falk, third access on the log, between Mars alteration and the anonymous read-only entry. She ran through every interaction she'd had with Falk in the past 72 hours, the speed with which Falk had answered her call, the precision with which she'd assessed the imaging angles, the moment in the kennel when she'd said that's a technique from military veterinary radiology and let it hang in the air without explaining how she'd recognized it. The way she'd looked at Natalie when she said that's actually what worries me, which at the time had seemed like professional concern and now read as something with more layers to it. Then she thought about the anonymous letter, the list of 17 case numbers, the read-only access 12 minutes after Mara closed the file, 2 different sets of credentials, 2 different people. She called Voss. The agent answered on the second ring. Before Voss could speak, Natalie said, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me the truth." A pause that was half a second too long. "What do you need?" The access log Ressa provided. "How many access entries does it actually contain?" The silence this time lasted 3 full seconds. "Natalie, how many entries?" Another pause. Then, quietly, 4. "You showed me 3. "Yes." She kept her voice even with some effort. "Whose credentials are on the 4th? Voss exhaled. It was not the exhale of someone unprepared for the question. It was the exhale of someone who had been waiting for it and hoping it would come later. "We're still working to contextualize the 4th entry before we—" "Agent Voss." Natalie said it the way you say a name when you want the person to understand that you're done with the version of the conversation that has padding in it. "Someone just called me from an unknown number and told me the 4th set of credentials belongs to Sandra Falk. I need you to confirm or deny that right now, because if it's true, I need to understand what it means before I talk to anyone else about anything." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Then Voss said, "Yes, it's her credentials." Natalie looked through the windshield at the empty road, at the dark outline of the hills, at nothing in particular. What does that mean? What was she doing in that file? "We don't know yet. The access is read-only, same duration as the anonymous entry. She opened it, read it, closed it. No edits. But the timing is 2 days before the anonymous entry, not after it. She read the original complaint before it was altered." A pause. "Possibly before she knew it was going to be altered. Or she knew it was going to be altered and read it first so she'd have the information." "Yes, that's also possible." Natalie thought about Falk answering her call in under 2 rings. About the 5-hour drive from Missoula that had delivered her to the clinic almost 40 minutes ahead of the time she'd estimated. Was she already planning to come to Dillon before I called her? The pause answered the question before Voss did. "Her vehicle was tracked entering Dillon County 2 hours before your call reached her," Voss said. "She was already on the way." "She knew about Bravo." "We think so. We're still—" "She knew about Bravo and she came here before I called, and she answered my call immediately because she was waiting for it." Natalie said it slowly, building it out loud. "She wasn't here because of the case. She was here because of me, because she's been watching for when this would surface." "Natalie, I need you to come back in. Tonight. Don't go to your house. Come directly to the clinic. I need to know who called me first. The unknown number. That wasn't your people." "No, we're working on tracing it. It was likely someone connected to Harwick's legal team. They've been trying to create confusion around witness testimony since the arrest." Voss's voice shifted into something more direct. "The call was designed to destabilize you, to make you distrust the investigation and the people around you before your next formal interview." "It worked partially," Natalie said, "but that doesn't mean the information was wrong." "No," Voss said, "it doesn't." She drove back to this clinic. Garrett was still there, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed he'd gone to the motel hours ago. But he was in the kennel room with Bravo again, the 2 of them occupying their mutual gravity in the quiet way they'd developed over the past 4 days. He looked up when she came in and read her face in the efficient way of someone trained to read faces. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it. Not because she'd fully decided to, but because she was tired of the calibrated version of honesty, and because he'd proven in the last 4 days that he could hold difficult information without making it dramatic. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he said, "What do you think Falk's role actually was?" "I don't know yet." She sat down on the floor, her default position in this room now, which said something about how the past 4 days had reorganized her relationship to formality. She read the original complaint before it was changed. She's been watching for when this would come back up. She came to Dylan before I called her, and then she gave us everything we needed: the secondary evaluation, the surgical assessment, the imaging confirmation. Everything she did here helped the case, which means she's either been trying to correct something she was part of, or she was never part of it to begin with. Yes. Garrett looked at Bravo. What does your gut tell you? Natalie considered not answering that because her gut and the available evidence were not always the same thing, and she'd learned to distinguish between them. Then she thought about the way Falk had sat on the kennel floor and reached a finger through the mesh and said, "He's beautiful," with the specific softness of a person for whom animals were not professional objects. That she's been carrying something for a long time, she said, and that she's been waiting for permission to put it down. So ask her. Natalie looked at him. It's not that simple. Most things that feel complicated are actually someone waiting to be asked directly, he said. In my experience, Buzz, Voss brought Falk in the following morning, not as a suspect, as a witness, which was a legal and practical distinction that Falk herself seemed to understand clearly when she walked into the consult room and sat down without being asked, and folded her hands on the table with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment more than once. Natalie was there at Falk's request. She'd asked for Natalie specifically when Voss had contacted her, which told Natalie something, though she wasn't yet sure what. Falk looked at her for a long moment before she spoke. I know you have questions. I have one question, Natalie said. What were you doing in that file? Falk was quiet for a moment, not evasive, gathering. I was on an oversight review board for the JWDP at the time. External veterinary advisory, no command authority. I had read access to program documentation as part of that role. She looked at her hands. Someone forwarded me a notification that a significant complaint had been filed. Informally, not through the board. Someone in Mar's office who thought I should know what was in it before it was dealt with. Who forwarded it? I don't know. It came through an intermediary, and I was never certain of the original source. She looked up. I read the complaint. I read what you had documented. The 11 cases, the discrepancies, the evaluation records. It was detailed. It was credible. She stopped. And then 2 days later, I checked the file again, and it was gone. The original was gone. There was a replacement document that didn't resemble what you'd filed. And you said nothing, Natalie said. I was an external advisory member with no investigative authority. I had read access to the file, but no documented record of having read it. The advisory board's system access was logged separately from the JWDP system. Falk's voice was careful and controlled, and underneath it, at some depth, there was something that had been compressed for a very long time. If I came forward with what I'd seen, I had no provable basis for having legitimate access to the original content, and Mara was the senior officer overseeing the program. She paused. He had relationships that made opposition professionally fatal for people in positions like mine. So you stayed quiet, Natalie said. I sent you the list. The room went still. Natalie looked at her. The 17 case numbers, Falk said. I compiled them from the program data I still had access to through the advisory board. I mailed them to your forwarding address because I didn't know how to help you directly without destroying what I'd built. And I told myself that giving you more information was something. She stopped again. It wasn't enough. I know that. Natalie sat with that for a moment. She had imagined the source of that letter many times over 4 years, built theories, discarded them, built new ones. She had never imagined someone like Falk, senior, established, credentialed, operating from inside a structure that gave her just enough access and not enough authority to do more than send an unsigned piece of paper to a forwarding address. "When I called you about Bravo," Natalie said, "you were already coming." I'd been monitoring Garrett Cole's public veteran community posts. He'd mentioned Bravo's mobility issues 3 weeks earlier. I recognized the pattern: movement compensation in a retired working dog from a naval unit. And I knew what evaluator had cleared Naval K9S in that period. So yes. Falk looked at her steadily. "I was already coming. I was hoping to find what I found." "Why didn't you just tell me?" It was the question with the most edges, and they both knew it. "Because I wasn't sure you'd trust me. And because I wasn't sure I deserved to be trusted." Falk's voice dropped slightly. "I spent 4 years telling myself that the list was enough, that giving you more information was the same as giving you help. It wasn't, and I knew it wasn't." She looked at Natalie directly. "I came here to do the thing I should have done 4 years ago, which is tell you what I know, in a room with investigators, on the record, where it can't be buried again." Voss, who had been silent through all of it, said quietly, "Ms. Falk, everything you've just said, are you prepared to put that in formal testimony?" "Yes," Falk said. "That's why I'm here." Chat. Falk's testimony took 7 hours across 2 sessions and produced 3 additional documentary threads the investigation hadn't previously had. The advisory board's internal communications about the JWDP, a record of informal complaints that had been raised and quietly dropped over a 5-year period before Natalie's, and, most significantly, a name connected to the intermediary who had first forwarded Natalie's complaint to Falk. An administrative coordinator named Paul Thress, who had worked in Marr's office, who had been transferred to a facility in Georgia 6 months after Natalie left, and who had agreed to speak to investigators within 4 hours of being contacted. The thing about a structure built on maintained silence is that once the first person speaks, the cost of continued silence rises for everyone else who knows. Thress had been waiting 3 years for someone to ask. He gave them a complete account of how Marre had handled the complaint, the meeting in his office, the instruction to Harwick, the paperwork alteration, the coordinated response to discredit Natalie's credibility before she could make the complaint public. He gave them dates, names, and a specific conversation he had personally witnessed between Marre and Harwick, in which the general had described Natalie's complaint as a problem to be managed rather than investigated. He also gave them the name of a second senior officer who had known and said nothing. The investigation, in the way of investigations when enough threads pull simultaneously, became briefly chaotic in the organized sense. New leads opening faster than they could be fully traced, each one producing 2 more. Voss spent most of the next 48 hours on calls Natalie wasn't part of, updating authorities she never met, feeding the machine of institutional consequence that had finally, after considerable resistance, turned in the right direction. Natalie worked. She did Bravo's morning and evening care with the focus of someone who understands that the ordinary necessary things don't pause for the extraordinary necessary things. She checked his inflammation markers, noted the improvement, adjusted the protocol. She treated the other animals in the clinic. She answered the questions that were put to her when she was called to answer them and waited out the periods between. On the 3rd morning after Falk's testimony, Garrett loaded Bravo carefully into the rear of his truck with the padded transport setup that Natalie had constructed from clinic supplies the night before, and she climbed into the back with the dog for the drive to Missoula because Bravo traveled better with someone familiar in his sightline, and Garrett needed to drive without worrying about what was happening behind him. She sat on the padded floor with her back against the seat and Bravo's head in her lap for most of the 4-hour drive. He slept for the middle 2 hours, his breathing slow and unlabored, and she watched the Montana landscape move past the window and thought about the strange and specific way that the right things sometimes found their way to each other. A retired war dog carrying a hidden injury to a small clinic in a town he'd never been in, finding the one person who would know exactly what it meant. She didn't romanticize it. It had also been brutal and frightening and had cost her sleep she didn't have and certainty she'd depended on. But it had happened, and it had mattered, and the dog sleeping in her lap was going to surgery in 2 hours. That was enough. Falk performed the surgery herself. It took 4 hours and 20 minutes. Natalie was not in the surgical suite. She was in the waiting area with Garrett, who had not been inside a waiting room for a person or an animal without being in motion or mission mode for so long that the sitting was visibly difficult for him. He stood up 3 times in the first hour, walked to the window, came back. The 4th time he stood up, Natalie said, without looking up from the outdated magazine she was using as a focal point rather than actually reading, "He's in good hands." Garrett stood at the window. "I know." "Then sit down. Your pacing isn't helping his hip." He sat down. They didn't talk for another 40 minutes. Falk came out of the surgical suite at the 3-hour mark to give them an update. The fracture site had been more complex than the imaging suggested. The callus removal had taken longer than planned, but the hip was stable and Bravo's vitals were strong. She looked exhausted in the way surgeons look when they have been focused on something very small and very important for a long time, and she met Natalie's eyes briefly before going back in. The surgery completed successfully. Not perfectly. Falk was careful to say that in the post-op briefing, when she walked them through what had been done and what the recovery would require and what realistic outcome looked like. The joint would be functional. He would need months of careful rehabilitation. He would not be the same animal at 8 that he might have been at 8 if he'd been caught at 6. The body keeps accounts of what's been done to it. "But he'll be comfortable," Falk said. "Genuinely comfortable, probably for the first time in more than a year." Garrett nodded. His jaw worked once. "Thank you," he said. It came out rough at the edges, the way things come out when they're carrying weight that words aren't quite wide enough for. Falk looked at him, then at Natalie. "Thank you," she said. "Both of you." Then after a pause, "I know that's inadequate." "It's a start," Natalie said. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't absolution, and Falk received it without pretending it was either. Some debts get repaid over time and through action, not in a single exchange. Falk understood that. She could see it in the way the other woman held the acknowledgement, not with relief, but with the sober recognition of someone who knows the work is not done, just begun. Clifton Marr was formally charged 6 weeks after Harwick's arrest. The charges were substantial: conspiracy to commit procurement fraud, obstruction of justice, suppression of an official complaint, and negligent endangerment of government property, the last charge covering the animals whose welfare he had sacrificed to protect the contract. His attorney issued a statement. Marra himself did not speak publicly. The arraignment was covered by 3 national outlets and 14 veteran and military affairs publications. The comment sections of those publications told their own story. Handlers who had known something was wrong, who had blamed themselves, who had spent years wondering if they'd missed something in the animals they'd brought home, finally having a name for the thing that had failed their dogs. Harwick entered a plea agreement 9 weeks after his arrest that required full cooperation with the investigation in exchange for a reduction on 2 of the 7 charges against him. The cooperation produced documentation that extended the known scope of the fraud to 23 dogs over 7 years, including the 3 Natalie had identified as deceased, and 4 more who had not survived to be accounted for. 23. The number appeared in the formal charging document and in the press coverage, and in the official notice that the DOD sent to the handlers of all 23 affected animals, and each time Natalie saw it, she thought about what it represented as individual lives. Not abstractions, not a policy failure in aggregate, but 23 specific animals who had served, who had trusted the people around them, and who had been sent away carrying pain that nobody with authority had chosen to address. She thought about that number and she let it hurt, because that was the appropriate response to it, and because she was done pretending that functional composure required the absence of feeling. What? The formal notification that Natalie's original complaint had been officially reinstated and reclassified came in the form of a letter from the JWDP Oversight Office, paper which felt appropriate, given that the original complaint had been filed on paper and had been destroyed on a system, so having the correction arrive on paper had a kind of symmetry to it. The letter acknowledged that the original complaint had been altered without authorization, that the investigation had confirmed the substance of the original allegations, and that the record had been corrected to reflect the accurate content and status of the filing. It was 2 pages. The language was formal and institutional and carried no emotion. She read it at the kitchen table of her rented house on the edge of Dillon at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold, and she sat with it for a long time before she folded it and put it in the file she'd been maintaining for 4 years. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would feel when she'd imagined it at all. There was no catharsis, no moment of completion, no particular sense of victory. There was instead a quieter and more durable thing, the specific satisfaction of knowing that the record was now accurate, that what had happened had not been successfully erased, that the truth had outlasted the people who'd tried to bury it. That was what she'd actually wanted. She hadn't known that until this moment, but she recognized it when she felt it. She called Ressa. Ressa answered in one ring. I saw the notification. How are you? Honestly, I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I made coffee. Then I cried again. A pause. How are you? I'm okay, Natalie said, and meant it in the partial, complicated way that okay means when it's accurate without being complete. Your daughter. Did you tell her anything? I told her I helped fix something that needed fixing. She asked if it was like when you put a fallen bird back in its nest. Natalie was quiet for a second. What did you say? I said a little bit, yes, except the birds were bigger. They stayed on the call for a while without talking much. It was the kind of call that exists to make the significant thing feel less solitary, and it did. Marchette. 3 months after the surgery, Garrett brought Bravo back to Dillon. He didn't say he was coming, just sent a text that said, in your parking lot if you have 5 minutes. She had 5 minutes. She had been having 5 minutes every morning for a week, in the inexplicable way that time sometimes reorganizes itself when the pressure that had structured it is removed. She came out the side door, and they were there, Garrett in his green truck, and Bravo beside him on a leash in the pale November light, and the dog was walking. Not compensating, walking. The gait even. The weight distributed correctly for the first time in what the record now documented as at least 14 months. He was slower than he'd probably once been, and he favored the operated side when he was tired and he would need careful management for the rest of his life. But he was moving without the particular wrongness that she'd clocked the moment she'd watched Garrett's truck pull in that first morning, before she'd even seen the imaging. Bravo saw her and came forward, not the lunge of that first morning, but something different. The walk of a dog who knows exactly who he's approaching and has already decided what he thinks about it. He put his nose in her palm the same way he always had, deliberate and unhurried. She crouched down and ran her hands along his jaw, his neck, down his flank to the hip, which was warm and solid and no longer flinched. She stayed crouched for a long moment. How's the rehabilitation going? She asked, not looking up. Physical therapist says he's ahead of schedule, Garrett said. She also said she'd never had a patient who took instruction more seriously. He was always a serious dog. He was always a dog who deserved better than what he got. He paused. So were you. She stood up. The November air was sharp and clean and smelled of the coming cold. She looked at Garrett, who was watching her with the direct, uncomplicated attention that was just his way with things he cared about. I got what I needed, she said. That's not the same thing. No, she said, but it's what matters. She'd thought about this, about what she deserved, what should have happened differently, what the correct accounting of it all looked like. She'd thought about it and found that the ledger, while real, wasn't where the useful work was. What she had was a corrected record, a dog who could walk without pain, a woman named Ressa who was raising her daughter in Laramie with one less weight on her chest, a list of 23 animals whose suffering had been documented and acknowledged. She had the cases that were now officially attributed to human failure rather than age-related deterioration. She had the handlers who had called the vet advocacy organizations in the weeks after the story broke, finally able to name what had been wrong. She had not gotten the career she'd had before. She had not gotten the 2 years she'd spent in Dillon existing at a distance from her own history, which she would have preferred to spend differently. She had not gotten the unbothered sleep she'd lost to the arithmetic of everything she knew and couldn't yet prove. Those things had been taken. They were not coming back. That was the truth of it, and she had made peace with the truth of it, imperfectly and without schedule. What she had now was the work in front of her, which was enough for a person who had never needed more than that. Ciao, 2 weeks after Garrett and Bravo's visit, Natalie received a call from the Department of Defense's Working Animal Welfare Office, a department that had not existed 6 months ago and had been created, in part, as a structural response to what the investigation had revealed about the oversight gaps in the evaluation system. The director of the new office was a woman named Colonel Petra Solis, retired, who had a background in both military canine operations and veterinary medicine, and who had been brought on specifically because she understood both sides of the system that had failed. Solis was direct on the phone in the way of people who have been in rooms where directness was a survival mechanism. "We're building a new evaluation protocol," she said, "from the ground up. Independent oversight, separate from the contracting structure, with mandatory imaging standards and a secondary review requirement for all musculoskeletal assessments." A pause. "I want a civilian advisor, someone who understands the clinical side and who isn't coming from inside the structure that failed." Natalie sat with the offer for a moment. "Why me specifically?" "Because you're the person who caught what nobody else was catching. For 4 years, with no institutional support, no authority, no backup." Solis's voice was matter-of-fact. "I need someone who knows how to see the thing that's being missed, not someone who knows how to run the system as designed. The system as designed is what got us here." "I have a job," Natalie said. "I know. The position is part-time advisory, flexible schedule. You could keep your clinic work." Another pause. "I'm not asking you to become someone else, Miss Cross. I'm asking you to apply what you already are to a problem that needs it." Natalie looked out the window of the supply room, where she was standing when the call came in, at the clinic parking lot and the road beyond it, and the low hills to the east going brown in the November cold. She thought about 23 dogs. She thought about the ones who hadn't made it to the number. She thought about all the handlers who were probably in the position Garrett had been in, trusting a system that had been designed to be trusted, not knowing they had been given something damaged and told it was whole. She thought about what Falk had said. You kept the truth. The distinction between keeping truth and keeping files, which had seemed small in the moment and now seemed like the center of everything. She had never been waiting for someone to discover her value. She'd been doing the work that needed doing, with the tools she had, in the circumstances she was in, without anyone's permission or recognition. That was not a virtue. It was just what you did when the work mattered more than the audience for it. But the work had always mattered, and it still did, and the opportunity to do more of it, in a context where it could reach further, was not something she could decline in good conscience. "All right," she said. "All right, as in yes?" "Yes." A pause. "I'll need flexibility during surgical recovery periods for clinical animals. I don't leave patients mid-protocol." "Understood," Solis said. "Neither do I." "Us." Prescott threw her a small clinic gathering the day she told the staff. Nothing elaborate, just coffee in the break room and a cake that Dana had clearly made herself, and that was delicious despite being slightly lopsided. Joel, who had spent most of the past 3 months quietly revising everything he'd assumed about her in the first year, said something that came out awkward and genuine in equal measure about how he hadn't realized. "Most people don't," Natalie said, without making it an indictment. Maya, who was more direct, "You could have told us." "I could have," Natalie said, "but I wasn't ready to be that person here. I needed somewhere to just be the work for a while." Maya considered that. "Fair," she said, which was the most Maya had ever offered on anything personal, and Natalie received it as the significant gesture it was. She stayed at the clinic. Part-time advisory work didn't require her to leave Dylan, and she found she didn't want to. Not because there was nothing else out there, but because this particular clinic in this particular town had done something for her that she hadn't known she needed, which was give her the space to carry what she carried without having to perform it for anyone. That was worth something. She wasn't interested in dismantling what had quietly held her together. Bravo's official case became part of the new evaluation protocol's foundational documentation, not as a cautionary tale, but as a clinical reference. The imaging techniques Natalie had used, the repositioning angles that Falk had recognized, the method of reading compensation patterns in a dog trained to hide pain, all of it was codified into the new secondary review standards. When Natalie first saw the technical document that referenced her methodology by case number rather than by name, she felt something she would have been embarrassed to describe out loud. A particular clean satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with the thing being there, in the record, available to the next person who needed to know it. She printed one copy of the page and put it with the letter about the reinstated complaint, in the same file she'd kept for 4 years. The file was almost full now. She'd need a new one. Tag. 6 months after the surgery, Garrett sent her a video. No message, just the video. It was 22 seconds long. It showed Bravo running, actually running, not the careful managed trot of early rehabilitation, but a full open run across a field in the morning light, his gait even and his head up, and his whole body moving with the unguarded freedom of an animal that has stopped protecting itself from the ground. He ran to the edge of the field and then turned and came back. And when he reached Garrett, he slowed and leaned against his handler's leg in the specific way of a dog who has been through a great deal and arrived somewhere good. Natalie watched the video 3 times. The 3rd time, she watched it to the end, and then she sat still for a moment, and she thought about all the things that had to happen for that 22 seconds to exist. The fractured hip that couldn't stay hidden, the small clinic in Montana, the morning a war dog had walked through the door and stopped for a woman everyone had stopped looking at. She thought about what that actually meant. Not as inspiration, not as the version of the story that gets polished for other people's consumption, but in the real, unvarnished sense. Sometimes the thing that saves someone else is the same thing that saves you, and you don't get to know that in advance. You just do the work. You keep the records. You stay in the room when everything in you wants to leave, because leaving doesn't actually make you safe. It just makes you a person who left. She had stayed. She had kept the truth, not because she'd known how it would end, but because she hadn't been able to make herself do the other thing, the easier thing, the thing she would not have been able to live with. That was not heroism. It was just what she was. She sent Garrett a reply. 3 words. He looks good. Garrett replied 40 seconds later with a single word. Yeah. Then, after a pause, one more message. So do you. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to check on the animals in the kennel because they needed checking on. And because that was what she did. And because she was, still and always, exactly where the work was. Some people wait their whole lives for someone to look close enough to see them clearly. Natalie Cross had stopped waiting. She had simply kept going. And that had made all the difference.